Hey everyone, welcome to the session. Delighted to have you all joining us today. I'm sure more people will join it as the session goes on, but I'll kick us off. Welcome to the session. I'm Sanjay Lobo, CEO of OnHand. I'll be moderating today's session on ED&I. First, starting off with some housekeeping. You should all be on mute, but if anyone finds themselves not on mute, please do mute. Always fun when that goes wrong. We've got a 45-minute session today. Hopefully about half an hour of that is speaking, lots of the panelists speaking at you, and hopefully some time for Q&A at the end. We've scheduled about 10 minutes for that. There is chat today, so please do use the chat function. We've got a couple of the OnHand team members, Susie I can see on screen, and Ali, who's probably off screen, will be moderating chat, so they'll be posting some questions there. Please do post your questions in there. Ali will be looking at those towards the end and directing those at the panel. All right, so enough for me to get started. I wonder if I could have the panel introduce themselves. Caroline, could I start with you?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi everyone, my name is Caroline Rainford. I'm the head of DEI at Betfair International and Pokerstars, which is a subgroup of the Flutter Group. And I am based in the UK, in South England, where it's lovely and sunny at the moment, so I'm hoping it will stay. And I'd like to pass on to Michael.
A very good morning. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Caroline. I'm very jealous. I've seen that Emily has dialed in from Barcelona. Now, that is very, very, very impressive. My name is Michael Barrington-Hibbert. I'm the founder and CEO of an executive search firm called Barrington-Hibbert Associates. I'm also one of the co-founders of 10,000 Black Interns, 10,000 Able Interns, and a massive fan of social impact. So super excited to get involved in this conversation. Hello from Glasgow. Yeah, is that a smiley emoji or is that a crying emoji? Because they've heard that Emily's in Barcelona. Enough of my intro. I'm going to pass it over to fantastic Celia.
Hi, everybody. A quick visual description of myself for anybody that needs it. I'm a white female. I've got light brown hair and it is tied up out of my face. I'm wearing glasses and a orange jumper, and I'm slightly regretting that because I'm facing my window. It's actually quite hot. So if I start looking more and more flushed, that's why. I'm sat in a red room with a big white fireplace. And for anybody using transcripts or closed captioning, I'm speaking with a Southern English accent. A little bit about me. My day job is I'm a policy designer. I'm a disabled individual and I work both here in the UK and internationally across various governmental institutions to analyse and introduce new policies and legislations that are accessible and inclusive. So a SPAD role. I'm also a disabled founder. I've set up a number of disabled-led organisations, including the first think tank in the UK, which focuses on disability. And I'm also an investor as well. So I wear many hats, focusing on improving inclusivity of the investment deal flow.
Thank you, panelists. So awesome set of panelists for today. And this one's a bit different, right? So this is the third in our quarterly series of impact speaker sessions. First one we had on homelessness, that was fantastic. And we had one on wellbeing earlier in the year. Today we're talking about equity, diversity and inclusion. But the panelist selection we have here kind of challenged us on not just having another webinar, very much challenged us on, can we go and find out from our customer base? We work with 250 companies in the UK and abroad. Can we go and find out what their real issues are today on equity and diversity and inclusion? And the results for me were surprising. For the panelists, I think they were kind of expecting some of the results we saw, and we want to get into some more of that. So let me just set the scene. Some of the stats we saw. So when we asked, do you feel adequately informed about your organization's ED&I policies? Hey, really good scores. 47% scored 8 or above, so out of 10, saying they felt really informed. Almost 70% said they felt informed, so really good scores there. That corresponds with over 50% saying they had ED&I training. And even better, some 78% of them rated that training at 7 or higher out of 10. So really, really good scores on getting training, understanding policies. But then there's a disconnect with what we saw from that training and the results there to what we saw next on actually taking actions and the stats we saw. So only 9.7% of respondents said they felt fully confident in dealing with ED&I matters in the workforce. So that's less than 10%. After all of that great work we saw on training. And then when we dug into that, so in terms of what areas they wanted more support on, it was pretty much everything. So over 50% of the people that said they were uncomfortable said they'd like help with all of the above, being disability, sex and gender, age, race, ethnicity, religion and belief, sexual orientation. So all of it, essentially. Before we go and talk about those findings from essentially a whole bunch of folks that are attending today and their teams, let's first set the scene. What's the opportunity here, and why is it important for leaders to take action now? Can I direct that question at Michael to get us going?
Sure. And once again, thank you so much for having me. I was one of the people that really pushed back on this webinar. I'm sure between myself and the other panelists, we have been speaking to it blue in the face on this particular topic. It's around the business case. If we turn on the news this morning, tomorrow, next week, we look at the country's tepid growth from a GDP standpoint. We look at organizations really struggling with the cost of living crisis, how it's impacting us as people in terms of our own pocket. So I think it really goes down to the actual business case. I think your stats, Sanjay, are compelling, that a number of people who've received coaching and training over the last 2 or 3 years are at a loss. And the simple element is that the business case and training and diversity policies are sometimes not interwoven. So if I can give you an example, my organization, as I mentioned before, is an executive search firm, and we predominantly work with financial services organizations. A US client of ours, or a client that became one of ours, lost out on a deal. And let me give you some context on that. One of their clients who deposited and used their business services wanted to get some advice with regards to possibly selling their organization. I can't go into the product detail because it will make it quite clear who the organization are, but they were a female-led organization that sold female products. And my client turned up to pitch for the work with an all-white male leadership team all over the age of 50. They lost the deal, and this company listed for over $1 billion, multiples of $1 billion, and it really impacted their bottom line. Then as a consequence, we were brought in to help work with them. If you look at Nike's hiring policy, the firm that has done it right is that 50% of their total hires globally is 50% gender. They look at the amount of ethnic minorities they bring in because they turn over $50 billion a year. The business case is there. And I'm sure with Caroline, she'll be able to talk about her experiences of dealing with consumers, because the demographics that we are working with are changing. Again, we look at the US, the dominant group from an ethnicity standpoint will be Latin Americans by 2045. What we have seen is that organizations have started to really invest in their businesses around covering the Hispanic population because of the revenue that they're going to get from that. So I think it's really important that, and when we were having this conversation, Sanjay, and why I wanted to come on, is we need to be able to, because we can talk about it being great, socially responsible, but what about businesses in Grimsby or Scarborough? Is the business case there to have a completely diverse ethnic minority representation where, proportionally speaking, the population isn't that high from an ethnicity standpoint? There might be another matrix that they can be held accountable to. So it's really understanding the business case around that and how it can actually impact organizations moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Hopefully setting the scene really nicely for the rest of our discussion today. I'm going to bring it back to that study and then bring in Caroline and Celia, sharing some of the verbatims from that study, which I hope, again, bring us back to what's really going on in the organizations. Here are some of the quotes we got about what people were concerned about. Sexism and age discrimination in the workplace perpetuated by those who are friends with board level members. Addressing non-binary colleagues doesn't come naturally and I find it uncomfortable. a comment was made about BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of colour employee in front of other colleagues with uneasy laughs. I unfortunately believe companies only promote ED&I to look good and not actually help or empower their disabled employees. I dislike being a number on their spreadsheets. And ultimately, this comment I think came out a lot. Frequently unsure what is okay or not to say on various topics leads to not saying something instead of perhaps making someone feel more included. So bringing, I think, Caroline, I'd love to get you into this conversation. We've heard so much about the training employees are receiving, and lots of it, which is great. But what's going wrong?
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. And you could see me nodding ahead as Michael was talking. I think, in my experience, I'm not surprised too by the findings. I think as someone who previously also worked in learning and development, I think we can spend a lot of our time in the design stage, where we're designing the greatest training in the world, but we're not thinking about that implementation plan. So further to what your studies showed is that great training, but now what? What do I do with that information? What are the tangible actions that I can actually put in place? So when I am in a situation where someone does say something offensive or inappropriate, how do I react to that? And so there's three things that come to mind. So the implementation plan, being really clear with people in terms of what are their expectations, what are you expected to do differently now as a result, and having those tangible actions in what I can do. I think also the accountability piece, how are we making people accountable for their actions? What is our speak up culture? Because the fact is, a lot of the things that we are dealing with in DEI are deep rooted biases, their societal issues, etc. And so to expect people just because they've been on training to suddenly feel comfortable, I don't think is fair. So it's also giving people tools in terms of when you don't always feel comfortable talking up in the moment, where do I go with that information? And that's where I can see that resistance. I think also in terms of the psychological safety piece, how much is the business culture really allowing people to feel safe to make mistakes? Because reading some of those comments as well from your respondents, there was that, feeling silly if I speak up and get it wrong. And I don't think often business cultures allow for people to make mistakes. It's almost like they're held to blame for making those mistakes. So I think there's a lot we can do around building that psychological safety and moving away from perfectionism. And to what Michael was talking about there, the business case as well, that resistance that we can also see in terms of what's in it for me. I think, again, we need to really be clear on what does that business case, as Michael has said, relevant to each of the areas maybe that our businesses are working in. And then the final one for me is around change management and really taking a change management approach to the way that we are embedding DEI programs to kind of make the changes small but tangible, so people don't, because it can be overwhelming. If you Google DEI, loads of things come up. And so it's really making it tangible for people. And what are those small, simple things that they can put into place that lead to inclusion? And I think those small acts will then definitely make a bigger picture. So yeah, I think three things, really about the implementation plan, really about addressing some people's fears through that concept of psychological safety, and then the change management piece for me.
Thanks, Caroline. Would love to bring you in here, Celia. So comments on the education and the cultural aspects and what you're seeing.
So first of all, I apologise. I have got an absolutely stonking cold. So if I sound very husky and a bit funny, that is why. I want to come in here and say that something that is often quite forgotten in the DI community is the best people to tell you what they need are the people themselves. And so often we're seeing kind of D&I being rolled out as this kind of generic, welcome to the firm, this is what you need to learn. And the words and the education that's being put over to these individuals are not coming directly from that community itself. So what we're seeing is the situation is, there's an expression, isn't there? Nothing about us without us. You can't have the conversation and the training and the learning without having the very people that's affected by it in the room. And following on from what Caroline was saying, people feel scared to ask questions. We live in a day and age of cancel culture, and people are terrified because we see constantly someone's made a mistake and this has happened, this has happened. You have to foster an environment where asking questions are okay, but teaching people that you ask questions with the correct intent. Are you asking this question because you're being a nosy bugger and you just want to find out and, it's designed to embarrass me, or you're going to ask me something inappropriate? Or are you asking me with the intention of the fact that you genuinely want to learn and you want to correct your mistakes? And I think it's really important that organizations are looking at the intention of these policies. They're looking at the intention of their education and fostering an environment where people feel able to ask questions because their intentions are good. Also want to follow on, Michael made a really good point about the business case, and I echo everything that he's saying. Accountability and responsibility are two very different things, and your organization needs both of those things. So you have to be accountable for what you're doing, but you also have to take responsibility. And I think those two things are very different. Almost accountability stems from responsibility. And I think if you've kind of got those two things working in conjunction, that's how you create that environment where you are actually progressing forward. And just the final thing to say on that as well is, it's all very well and good to learn what discrimination is. What's the definition of ableism? It's the direct or indirect discrimination of disabled people. Great, I know that. I'm not doing that intentionally. We aren't learning what that looks like in practice. We know that that means don't shout at people in the street, don't use racial slurs, don't use ableist slurs, don't use homophobic slurs. We know that. We've grown up with that and we understand that. Do we understand that it goes so much further about, not using expressions like, oh, it was totally in my blind vision, or I was totally blind to it, or that was crazy, that was mad. This is language we shouldn't be using, but nobody is teaching us that. So when we say it, and we're saying it in an environment where we don't have the correct intentions to ask questions, then people are getting into trouble. And I think it's really important that when you're doing these trainings, when you're doing inclusion, you have to have the people in the room to say, excuse me, can I ask this question because I don't know? We see a lot as well, bringing it back to disability. Do you say people with disabilities or do you say disabled person? There's a correct one and a wrong one if you're talking about a community of people. Individuals can pick their own identity and no one is ever to say otherwise to that. But when you're speaking about a group of people, how many people on this call know the answer to that question, even though the majority of them have probably had training around disability discrimination? And I think it's a really good example of the fact that we understand it on a very kind of surface level, but we have to dig deeper and say, what does this look like in practice? What I should be doing? What shouldn't I be doing? Looking at my language, and that applies to kind of all sections of our society, which I think is really, really important. And just, I know I'm waffling, going on to what Michael said about the business case, another thing I would add there is the fact that if you are pitching to consumers, we look at the diversity of our community. Again, a quarter of our population are disabled. If you're selling a product and 25% of your potential audience identifies as disabled, but you've got no one disabled in your team, how on earth are you going to make a product that is suitable for everybody? You can't. You're financially missing out huge sectors of society just by not being inclusive within your own firm, because you can't identify and you can't communicate properly with the communities that are your potential consumers. So I think that's a really good point to add on to what Michael was saying at the beginning.
Celia, if I can, and that is awesome. Thank you so much. I've got my notebook here and I'm scribing away. So thank you guys so much. This is super helpful from a theoretical standpoint, right? So if I listen to what you're saying and Caroline's saying, and one of the big pushbacks that I had with Sanjay, and I do smile, by the way, but I find this is serious business, D&I. If the people who have dialed into this call are all passionate for one reason or another, okay, and some of them are trapped, frankly. And again, we speak about the cost of living crisis. We talk about hybrid working and how a number of larger organizations have actually put pressure on people to go back into work, okay? So you've got this naked hand effect where you've got big brother sort of pushing little brother or sister, let's add, and they're losing a voice. And so what will be super helpful in both spectrums, where you've got HR directors on this call who are passionate around diversity, they get the message, but for one reason or another, they're not able to have that conversation or not able to convince their leader to be able to sort of truly invest in that. So would love to sort of get both you and Caroline's thoughts on that. But then equally, let's take it back to like SMEs. SMEs are the backbone of the UK economy. 80% of UK companies are SMEs. How do we then sort of translate what we're talking about here from a theoretical standpoint to then bring it into a practical standpoint in terms of bringing that whole D&I journey alive, and the business case when the person who owns a distribution company is struggling with rent, struggling to put their trucks on the roads and things of that nature. Is it possible that either yourself or Caroline could sort of give some context on that, if I may?
100%. And I think that's a brilliant point you make. And around SMEs, I get asked this question all the time saying, I can't afford to do this. I can't afford to have my website designed accessibly. I can't afford to add widgets. I can't afford to do this, this, and this. The first thing I'll always say is you can't put a cost on someone's human rights. Accessibility and inclusion are a basic human rights. And the fact that we've reached a point where people are deciding between things is very concerning. And I think the message that people should kind of resonate with is, if you are an SME, is from the point of design. When you are setting up your website, do it accessibly. Don't, wait for the problems to accumulate and then have to go back and pay someone an additional amount when you could have done it from the outset. It's always important to remember the fact that there are so many assets and things like that available online from the community. If you reach out and you ask for help, if you're an SME, there will be other SMEs willing to help you. And there's kind of 3 C's I always think about, which is collaboration, community, and consistency. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. If you are on your own, you are going to hit walls and you're going to hit barriers. Reach out to people and ask the questions and get the help. But from the point of design, if you're doing it right from the beginning, not only are you saving yourself financial implications in the future, but you're also opening yourself to a much larger consumer market. And then if we kind of go up into larger organizations, if we're looking kind of Series A to E and beyond, my advice would be there is that disconnected conversation, because again, people go, oh, the cost, or what's this going to do, or how are we going to do this? We can't hire a wheelchair user because, we're going to have to put a ramp in. How much is that going to cost? We have access to work. We have the Disability Confidence Scheme, which is run by the government. All free tools that organizations should be using. They're free and they're readily available, but people don't know that they exist. And going back to what Caroline was saying at the beginning, which I think was a brilliant point, is stagnate yourself, set out your plan. What are we doing right now? What can we do that doesn't cost anything? In all of our marketing, are we using alt text? Have we got captions? Are we getting transcripts? When we put anything online, are we putting it out on easy read? Are we putting it out in wide space? What can we do in this immediate moment to fix things? Then you kind of look at the middle stage and say, what can we do that's maybe going to take a couple of weeks, a couple of months, but we need to start that trajectory. We need to get it going. We need to budget for this and we need to make sure it's happening. So, if we've had no training around race or religion or anything like that, where can we start to go in the next couple of months? And then your third stage is, what are our ingrained policies which are wrong? And again, I would say you have to have people that represent the diversity of our society in your core leadership team. It's, I'm sure we're all very familiar with the lack of representation on the FTSE 100. It's a prime example of the situation we are in and something that we need to address. But those longer term policies of, we can't change that now. We acknowledge that. But what we're acknowledging is that we're going to move towards that. And again, it brings it back to that conversation of intention. From the point of design, getting it right. If you've made a mistake, identify it and look at the kind of process to eradicate that mistake. But again, I bring it back to that kind of overarching quote. You can't put a cost on someone's human rights. If you have racial bias within your organization and you're sat there saying, how much is it going to cost us in training to eradicate racial bias? I think you've got a more systemic problem than perhaps you even realize. It is deeper entrenched if the cost outweighs kind of eradicating that kind of discrimination from your organization. I think that's a signal that there's actually a much larger problem, because that, again, is a very conscious bias to have taken. Sorry, that was very rambly.
No, I was just going to finish. Yeah, I was just going to say on that one, I think, Celia, everything you're saying, I agree with. I think I heard a quote that if your system wasn't designed to include everyone, then it was designed to exclude someone. And I think that's what your message was speaking to me. I think utilize the resource groups that you've got as well. Like, if your business does have employee networks, then utilize their knowledge. They're a free resource that's readily available, who are comfortable talking about the issues. Because one thing I certainly have seen in my experience is the very groups that you need to be included don't always feel comfortable talking. So I think if you've got any sort of employee resource or employee networks, that's also a good place to start. And going back to what I said earlier, I do believe in small wins. I think even from a reasonable adjustments perspective, there is a belief that it's going to be so costly to make reasonable adjustments, where someone's reasonable adjustment might be, actually, I need to start a bit later, or I need free software, but I just need it to be authorized by our IT systems. So I think definitely start small, and there's lots of things that, to your point, Celia, that you mentioned, that's available, but also go to those resource groups that are really comfortable in sharing their lived experience to help inform some of the things that you're trying to do.
I completely agree with that. And there's an example in there is the fact that we call it reasonable adjustments for disabled people, or somebody that has a religious commitment, or, might not be able to work on a Friday, whatever it may be. Sorry, what's an unreasonable adjustment? If somebody has an adjustment that they need based on their accessibility or whatever it may be, or needing to take some time off, or whatever the situation is, in business, why are we still calling it reasonable adjustment? Surely, I'd love to hear a definition of an unreasonable one, because in business, I've not yet come across one. I think if you're working in that business environment, you know what you can ask for, and you know what might be a slight stretch. But that's again prime example of the fact that if we're using this kind of messaging all throughout our policies and our organizations, we're further kind of entrenching that with people. If your policies, when you sign your document and you sign your contract, have got biases within there, in that hidden language where we don't even realize we're doing it, we're just passing that on again to our employees, aren't we? So we're having all this training to unlearn all this behavior. If I'm signing a document that's got unconscious bias within it, it's very mixed messaging, and it creates that environment where, again, people feel like they can't ask questions, and people feel like they're going to get into trouble. So I think that's a really good example, and I agree with everything that you said, Caroline.
Hey, panelists, this is a great conversation. Moving it into actions, which I think we've already done in the last 5 minutes. We're trying to aim this session at leaders, and I'm sure we've got a bunch of HR folks on this session too, and we've encouraged them to bring their C-suite with them, or share this afterwards, and there will be a recording that we send out. So thinking about those leaders who hopefully get to see this session already, really listening in, what's an action we're kind of recommending they take today? And I've heard a few, but Michael, perhaps I can get you to jump in at this point.
Yeah, cool. So I think going back to what Caroline said, actually, starting out small. The reality is not many organizations in the UK from a FTSE 100, 250, 350 perspective have made significant sort of developments. The fact that there's more men called John on FTSE 100 boards than there are female is a testament to that. Okay, so I think it's a case of starting out small. So the big piece is around data collection, which certainly is something which would help. And it's actually sort of being brave enough to actually look at that and address it. So I'll give you an example. I started a diet January the 1st. And it was quite sort of disheartening, because from a data standpoint, I knew my shirts and my trousers were a little bit snug, but then I peeked at the data, which was my weight. And then I had maybe a week or so of actually not processing that data. I comforted myself by eating more chocolate eclairs. But sometimes that is the issue that a number of organizations have. When they look at the data, they'll cut and slice that data to reflect what looks good for them. So I think going back to Caroline's point is actually looking at the data. I think it's a case of also being brave, going back to the point that Celia mentioned around embracing, I don't want to say failure, but it's actually being able to share learnings and exercise. And I think once you're able to look at the data component, then you can actually build a cohesive plan. You can then actually start to have more inclusive conversations in terms of, actually, we are a Grimsby cheese factory. We are a family-owned business. We're a FTSE 350, and we have gender representation. What we want to do for our organization, we want to partner with 10,000 able interns in terms of developing a pipeline. We want to hire more non-graduates, people on apprentice schemes, but it's going to be unique for you. And that's maybe one of the two takeaways that I will give people on this webinar. Start out small, data collection, but also actually know your organization and understand your customers in order to make a decision in terms of how your organization approaches D&I and inclusivity.
Caroline, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So on top, building on Michael's points there, I think the leaders to start with themselves. I'm a big fan of self-education. And I think, again, if you're fortunate that you've got a DEI team, even if you don't have a DEI team within your organization, there are a number of tools and resources available out there. So I've been taking leaders through inclusive leadership training, and I've seen some great results in terms of that furthering self-education, giving them the comfort to deal with some of those discomforts that they feel in terms of addressing issues and talking about points. And I'm also a believer that your business can only grow as much as the leader grows. So, what is the saying that a leader is a reader? And so I think there is so much tools and resources available that I think leaders should start with themselves. And then it's the next part for me is role model that inclusive behavior, because it's a number of organizations are hierarchical and people do look to the leader. And it's one of the reasons that we started the inclusive leadership journey with our most senior leaders, because we knew the important role that they have, but we also know that every manager, every leader has a role too. And I think the other part for me is around advocating for change, and leaders have to advocate for change because they have the power and privilege. So whatever they have that seat at the table, we need them to be applying that DEI lens. And I think that starts with becoming aware through that self-education piece.
And Celia, any final thought or action you'd like leaders to be taking?
I echo everything that Caroline and Michael said. I think it's utterly brilliant. And to what Michael said is identify where you're going wrong. Hold your hands up and say, we are making a mistake, or we have identified this. That is much more powerful to do that than to sit back and say, yeah, we know everything, we're doing everything right, because guaranteed you are not. It's an ever learning process. Just because you are born with identity doesn't mean you understand every complex annex of intersectionality. My other piece of advice would be, you cannot annex areas of DEI into their own categories, whether it's race, religion, gender, sexuality, disability, or non-disability. Everything is intersectional. Everything coincides with one another. So I take myself, for example. Yes, I'm disabled. Yes, I'm a woman, but I've also grown up in the south of England, and I am white, and I recognize the privileges that has brought me in life. And so I am in a much more privileged position than perhaps somebody else who identifies with very similar characteristics of me, but their race or where they grew up is different. And so I think when you're having a conversation about D&I, you cannot separate things out. It is one large kind of conversation that is so intersectional, and there's so many elements playing around in it. And it's much more powerful to sit back and say, we have identified a problem here, and we are going to be proactive. The messaging that I would give is, there's a slogan I always say to leaders is, be proactive, not reactive. Don't wait for it to happen and then address it and say, look how wonderful we are, we've eradicated this problem that we did have and it's happened. Be proactive and say, we've identified that this is a potential problem either now or going to happen in the future, and we are being proactive to eradicate it. Because at the end of the day, if we're kind of sitting around not addressing these things, we're all bound by the Equality Act. Very large organizations are bound by the Public Sector Equality Duty Act. There is legislation that is binding us all together from a purely legal standpoint. And I will say that my background is law, which is why I'm kind of bringing this up. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you have violated somebody's human rights, and you will be held accountable for that, because especially now in the days of technology and communication, that will be very visible. So from a business standpoint, you need to identify these things before these very large incidents happen, and be proactive, not reactive to situations.
Thanks, Celia. Okay, so we've got just over 10 minutes to go, so we'll go into Q&A. Before we do, so look, loads of great comments throughout this session. We will have the recording so you can go over those, but things I picked up on, and there's lots of little actions and then ranging to bigger actions. But use your people, something I heard in there quite a few times. The people that don't know what to do, find them and have sessions with them. That's a relatively straightforward thing to do, and let people be open about what they're struggling with, so you can try and identify those things. Find the people who actually know the issue because they're going through it, and they're the ones that are comfortable to speak about it. Find those people. There will be people in your organization that are happy to speak about the issues they face. I think you can also, Celia mentions addressing things as you go, like when you're starting off, if you're a small business and you're looking at your first website, hey, take the action to make it accessible. Do it from day one versus day 100, because it gets harder to do the more you build. There are things out there you can use your community for. There's grants. There's also free things. Celia's picked me up on alt text. It's simple things that anyone can do. It doesn't cost you anything, but can you make things accessible in a very simple steps? I think you can. The harder things, Michael said, be brave. Caroline also points to the data. Pick out the data. Where are we going wrong, right? So OnHand survey, we've made that available to everyone. If you haven't got it already, please do ping us and we'll send over the results to you. But where are we going wrong? Use that as the basis if you haven't got more data points already. Like only 10% of respondents, which were, I think, a bunch of companies that attended today and your employees, only 10% or less felt really comfortable in ED&I scenarios and dealing with those. And probably the big one that I pull out is leaders need training, and that's kind of full stop. Culture starts from the top. If you want to get this stuff right, it's got to start at the top and trickle down. All right, let's go into Q&A. Ali, would you mind jumping on and pointing some questions at us?
Yeah, perfect. First, just want to say thank you to Michael, Celia, and Caroline. You've all brought such great insights to the table that I'm sure we'll all be thinking about in the weeks, months, years to come after this webinar. Our first question, quite relevant to what's been talked about today. We are a young company, just turned 2. We have an ED&I policy and committee. But what things would you advise that we do that you wished you could have done sooner?
I think for me, as I'm off mute first, it's definitely starting at the top and making sure you've got that leadership buy-in in terms of having those conversations very early on. And to, I think Celia has mentioned it a number of times, involving people. Like that, it'd be interesting to know whether that EDI policy was co-created or was it just created in the absence of people. So going back to that point of designing things with people in mind and with those that will be impacted, but definitely having those conversations and getting everyone aligned before you put any form of training out there, I think is really important, and being authentic with it. I think loads of people are on different journeys, and so forth. There is not a one size fits all. Everyone is going to take away training, for example, in their own perception. So I think it's really making sure that everyone is aligned with whatever that means for them from their perspective.
I'll come in now as well. I completely agree with what Caroline said, and also, you can have all the D&I policies in the world, but at the end of the day, you have to respect individuality of an individual. You cannot categorize everybody under one umbrella. So, we look at umbrella of sexuality or gender or race or religion or whatever it may be. No two people have the same experiences in life. No two people might use the same language, and Lauren put a really good comment in the Q&A about around disability and how we address people. It's the prime example of, we say, disabled people because we use language first and in the social model, but some people prefer being identified in a different way, and that is absolutely fine. You cannot blanket policy everybody. You have to have that policy underlining in your organization and kind of drip feeding through and being at the core of what you're doing. But you have to allow movement to respect individuality, because if you don't do that, what you're going to do is land yourself in a whole host of problems. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier of the fact that you have to respect intersectionality as well. A really good example of this is somebody might identify with 2 different categories, whatever. I hate the term minority selected characteristic, but I'm going to use it for this kind of example. If somebody's protected characteristic, you're asking about their race or their religion or their sexuality or their disability, and time and time again we see tick one box. Some people might not identify with just one box. Quite often we see things working in collaboration with somebody. Somebody might not identify as female or as male or as non-binary. Someone might identify with all 3 of those categories. So that's like a prime example of the fact that you have to allow movement in the policies that you're creating to recognize individuality and recognize that not everybody is the same just because they fall under one umbrella. Yeah,
that's great. Do you mind if I think that's been covered super well, so I'm not going to add on that. I don't think I can do. Can I just go to one of the questions that Emily's put in here, and she's basically saying, I see companies who thankfully support D&I, who put money into D&I organizations and do really try not to discriminate, yet laziness leaves them with a predominantly white, straight, CIS male-abled leadership team. That's a great question, so thank you. So going back to that diet analogy, I'm really upset that no one in the chat group should have said, Michael, you don't need to be on the diet. So the fact that
was a given.
I was met with a welcome silence. It's just devastating to me. But look, with anything like this, it takes hard work, you know, and I think in terms of how I started the webinar with regards to the headwinds which is facing the UK economy, what we have seen as an executive leadership organization, where firms 2 years ago, where we're in the pandemic, debt was cheap, the stock market was going through the roof, we're all working from home, organizations started to promote more diverse leaders, whether it be women, more ethnic minorities, okay? And what's now happened, the headwinds have changed. And now as a consequence, what is now happening, organizations are going back to type. Now, if I can just strip it out for 1 second and not use organizations, and maybe let's think about our own homes, for example, where we were flush with a little bit of cash and we decided to put an extension on, okay? But we use someone that we hadn't used before, and we might move fast forward where our budgets are getting tighter. We're not necessarily going to go back to that person that we necessarily used to do our extension. We're going to go back to a tried and tested Sparky that have been working with our family for the last 10 years or so. It's a really bad analogy, but what I'm just trying to sort of demonstrate, it's sort of behavior change, and it does start at the top from an education standpoint, but you've also got to realize that those at the top are white males. And it's trying to get them to understand that in order for the UK to turbocharge its way out of suppressed market and start competing against the United States and the Middle East and Asia, we need to do something different, because we are unfortunately are sleepwalking into a really slow growth economic environment if we don't make those changes. So it's really just, again, reiterating the business case. But the challenge is those leaders will be retired in 10, 15 years time, and it won't necessarily be their problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just echo that, I think so. I can see Sonia's asked a similar training or a similar train of thought around how we should. I think it was around how far training can go. Shouldn't we also think about how we choose leaders? And I think it is looking at your succession plans, and also even questioning why those people are in your succession plans. Because to your point there, Michael, which I thought was really well put, in terms of, I think in COVID, everyone was on the same level playing field. So you got to see people that you ordinarily wouldn't. And it's moved to going back to office. You've got that affinity bias back again, haven't you? In terms of, you know, people like people that are similar. And I think if you're in an office of people, then it's more likely you're going to be around people that you are quite similar with. So yeah, I do agree with what Sonia said there about how do we choose, how are we recruiting our future leaders? And I think it's questioning who are in our succession plans in the first place. And are there others that perhaps maybe they're not ready now, but they'll be ready in 3 years if we gave them the right support and growth that they need, and that should ideally be the most diverse candidates as possible in those succession pools? Or are we just, again, repeating what we've always had?
Hey everyone, we are coming up to the final minute of this session. So there's lots of questions that have come in. I can see some of those. I'm guessing the audience can't see them all. They come in, some to everyone, and then just to the hosts and panelists. So we're running out of time, and I don't think we can get to everything. I think there's lots of takeaways from today. I hope every organization can use, but we're far from done on this topic, I think, is the real summary. There's some folks who have asked questions around, well, what happens next, and more recommendations. This is not like a one-off on hand. We feel like the survey we've done, it's different. We haven't done this type of thing before, but we feel like we should repeat it. I think we'll do it on at least annual basis. Hopefully we can repeat a session like this and hopefully see progress, at least within the organizations we work with. For now, we will be sharing that recording. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll send that out shortly after this session. Thank you to our panelists, Michael, Caroline, Celia. Wonderful conversation. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for now, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.